Good evening. I am Lynette Ba, coordinator of the Performing Arts Series here at the auditorium. And before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge the presence of our Honorable Premier, Dr. Deolando Smith, and his wife, Mrs. Lorna Smith. And we also have member of the House, Honorable Dolores Christopher. And I give a warm welcome to everybody for joining us here this evening. On behalf of the H. Labadie Community College and the members of the Lecture Series Committee, it has been indeed a pleasure to see the series return to the college. We truly believe that the Community Lecture Series is an important event. It helps to inform and educate our community with issues faced in our everyday lives. It also keeps us engaged in order to be better to find better solutions and have better understanding for the number of issues that affect us both locally, regionally, and worldwide. For this reason, we encourage you to continue to support the H. Labadie Stout Community College and this initiative. I would like to welcome to the stage Mr. Kedrick Malone, chairperson of the Community Lecture Series.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for this evening, our guest lecturer for this evening. Professor Max Hilaire is a graduate of Morgan State University. He holds a master's degree in philosophy, a PhD degrees in international relations with concentrations in international law, international organizations from Columbia University in New York. He has lectured in 70 universities and institutions in over 45 countries and has taught students of more than 75 different nationalities. Professor Hilaire has traveled extensively in Africa, Europe, and Latin America as a public diplomacy speaker for the State Department. He has conducted training for diplomats and senior government officials from a number of African countries. He's also helped to mitigate conflict in Ghana, Angola, Ghana, Mozambique, Malawi, and Nigeria. During the past 2 years, Professor Hilaire has delivered a number of distinguished lectures on a wide range of international issues. He has served on the State Department's Performance Board, the Department of Commerce Promotion Board, and the United States Agency for International Development Evaluation Board. Professor Hilaire has also served as the Chief Fulbright Board on the Senior Fulbright Board, has served as a facilitator for the African Center for Strategic Studies Senior African Leaders Program. He's currently working on 2 manuscripts entitled United States Foreign Policy and Foreign Relations Law, Continuity or Change, and the International Response to African Conflicts. He is a frequent media contributor on domestic and international affairs for both the national and international media. He has presented at a number of international conferences on the rule of law, public international law, and human rights and international humanitarian law. He is a recipient of numerous awards, including the Washington Center Faculty of the Year Award and other awards. He currently serves as the chair of the Department of Political Science at Morgan State University, and he serves on the Washington Center faculty in DC, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin, the Empire State College in Prague. Professor Hilaire is a member of the American Society of International Law, the American Political Science Association, and the Czech Society of International Law. And his extended bio is on the back of the program, and you can take a look at his eminent qualifications. So it goes without saying that Professor Max Hilaire is very well versed in international issues, and we are very privileged to have him here with us this evening. So please join me in welcoming him to the podium. Professor?
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Members of the panel, distinguished guests, and particularly the Honorable Premier, Dr. Smith, OBE. I was just reading about the Premier on my way here, and it was quite a surprise. I didn't expect I would be meeting him here tonight, but I assume as a community person, he made an effort to come hear me. So I told the Premier I'm going to be very controlled in what I say because I did not expect him to be here tonight. But anyway, to continue, I want to thank the faculty and students there, and thank you for Lynette Smith in particular, Lynette Barr, who was my student at Morgan State University many years ago. And Lynette came to my office quite frequently. Whether I like it or not, I had to make time for her. And we've stayed in touch over the years since Lynette returned to the Virgin Islands. And this is the second time on a very busy schedule that she's invited me to come to the BVI. And I've accepted the invitation, notwithstanding other commitments I've had. But when a former student like Lynette called and asked for me to come to the BVI, I can't say no. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank my wife and my daughter for joining me here tonight. My wife and I sailed the BVI in the summer on our 20th wedding anniversary. And my wife became convinced that the BVI was more beautiful than the US Virgin Islands, which I took issue with her. But you can't disagree with your wife if you want to remain married. So, but I do agree the British Virgin Islands is the best kept secret in the world, and we need to keep it that way. I also want to pay tribute to a person after whom this college is named, H.L.S.C.C. Stout, the Chief Minister, who is a true Caribbean patriot. Unlike Dr. Eric Williams, Norman Manley of Jamaica, and Grantley Adams of Barbados, was a true visionary. There is no better way to improve the lives of people in the Caribbean than through education. Chief Minister Stout recognized that and established this college to fulfill his mission. The people of the Caribbean have made great strides in education. However, too many of our young people are denied access to higher education to the detriment of the economic development of the Caribbean. So I commend the faculty, the staff at this college, and particularly Chief Minister Stout for having the vision to establish this school to train not the next generation of BVI leaders, but the next generation of leaders of the Caribbean and leaders of the world. Now, I want to begin my address, which the title tonight is The Politics and Policies of the Trump Presidency, Its Impact on the Caribbean and the BVI. I think many of you know Donald Trump doesn't quite have a policy, but I'll try my best to decipher or dissect some of what I've extrapolated from his comments, particularly during the campaign. I don't follow him on Twitter, so I can't tell you exactly what how his policies change in his tweets. But I'll do my best to be as accurate and as objective as possible in terms of where President Trump stands on key foreign policy issues and how it may impact the Caribbean and particularly the BVI. President Trump ran for office without an agenda, never believing that he would be the President of the United States today. His campaign was part publicity and part his television show, and also a part of his ego. Trump never laid out a plan in the event he would win the presidency. Consequently, he was ushered into the presidency of the United States without any preparation for the job. Trump's campaign was one of promoting hate and division. He made many outrageous comments that infuriated many segments of the US population, particularly minorities and immigrants. No one in their wildest dreams expected Trump to be president of the United States. In fact, I was in Mexico City lecturing the night of the election of President Trump, and on my way back to the hotel, one of the faculty members said, well, it doesn't look good for Hillary Clinton. And I said to him, well, we still have New York, California, and the entire West Coast, so let's give it a break. So I got back to the hotel and I turned on the television and I saw what the Electoral College map was looking like, and I turned it off and went to sleep. So I didn't know who won until I got up next morning after I walked out of the hotel and looked at the headlines on the Mexican dailies, and I need not repeat what the headline said, but it was not very good for Trump or for the people of Mexico. Trump projected an image of stupidity and a lack of understanding about basic fundamentals of the structure of the United States government or the world. He was always vague about his plans and never provided any specifics as to what he would do to improve the American standing in the world or to fix the many domestic problems plaguing the United States. He basically asked his voters to elect him because he was a successful businessman and would do the same to fix the US economy. Many voters bought into Trump's rhetoric, and today, here we are with President Trump, who is still on a campaign trail and has not really gotten down to governing. Trump's campaign was based on a white nationalist racist agenda, which called for returning America to the days when whites were in the majority and enjoyed tremendous privileges because of their race. He and his supporters, which are predominantly poor, uneducated whites, resented the fact that the demographic trends in the United States is shifting to a more majority population, in fact. In fact, in California, Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, these states are all majority, minority, or close to it. And in the 2020 census, it's likely that a number of these states will be majority African American and Latino. Trump has signed a number of executive orders to reverse some of President Obama's signature domestic and foreign policy accomplishments. He has abandoned the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership with 11 Asian countries. He's called for renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement. He's suspended talks on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with Europe, reverse bans on measures to reduce global warming and climate change, call for a 20% border tax, and to punish companies that outsource their operations overseas, threaten tariff on China, Germany, and Mexico, and impose the ban on citizens of 6 predominantly Muslim countries from coming to the United States, and suspend resettlement of Syrian refugees into the United States. Trump has also called for reforming the tax code. In fact, yesterday or day before, he released a partial summary of his new tax proposal. And the tax code would encourage or would reduce the rates from 35 to 15% to also reduce the tax burden on individual taxpayers. The tax proposal of President Trump would encourage American companies to repatriate their overseas assets to the United States, and for in so doing would also force wealthy Americans to repatriate their assets being held in safe tax havens overseas. Trump has accelerated the deportation of undocumented foreigners in the United States and made it difficult for foreigners to obtain visitors' visas to come to the United States. His first 100 days in office, which will be on Saturday, has been strong on symbolism, but lacks any concrete proposal or policy accomplishments. Trump has signed an executive order to repeal the Dodd-Frank Act, which was passed by Congress in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And one of the key aspects of that act, which will affect and fuel conflicts in Africa, is the extractive mineral provision, in which American technology firms are required to disclose and to inform the SEC and the Justice Department where they're getting their critical raw minerals from. Much of that is coming from conflict zones in Africa, where rebel groups are selling diamonds, gold, coltan, and others to these companies, and in turn, these companies are making huge profits. But a country like DRC or Sierra Leone, it's almost impossible to make a phone call across these countries. He has also threatened to repeal the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so American companies can compete with other countries for lucrative contracts. During the presidential campaign, Trump said little by way of his foreign policy and had absolutely nothing to say about the Caribbean. He has yet to articulate a foreign policy in which he spells out more specifically what role he expects the United States to play in the world. His campaign slogans, "Make America Great Again" and "America First," were just campaign slogans, but do not reflect the realities of international politics and the transformation of the global economy. We live in an interdependent world where borders are porous and politics is driven by global economic forces and technological innovation. The United States is no longer the dominant economic power, but China is. And even though it remains the indispensable military power, it cannot win today's wars by simply projecting its military might around the world. Today's wars are a result of poverty, greed, social and economic dislocation, religious and ethnic rivalries, and more importantly, political repression in so many countries, whether it's Turkey, it's Venezuela, and many African countries. These wars cannot be solved by military means alone, and we see in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the United States, which is the #1 military power, 7 countries combined do not meet the US military expenditure, and yet the United States has found itself fighting the longest war, not against an equal army, but against a ragtag, invisible opponent like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So these wars are more sophisticated and would require a more comprehensive policy approach to addressing the root causes of these conflicts. Trump's isolationist policy fails to capture the essence of international affairs and it demonstrates a lack of understanding of the complexity of the global problematic we are dealing with today. No country can insulate itself from the problems of the world. These problems know no boundaries, and no one nation can solve these problems by itself. The need for global leadership, multilateralism, is more acute today than in previous eras. Yet we have in Washington an administration that is clueless about the nature of America's domestic politics and international affairs. Trump's first 100 days, which again comes on Saturday, has left the world guessing as to what we can expect from this administration going forward. In fact, one would hope the next 100 days would be more productive, more on substance and less on symbolism. United States policy towards the Caribbean has remained relatively unchanged since the end of the Cold War. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have basically treated the Caribbean as their backyard and hoped no outside power would meddle in the affairs of the region. The Caribbean has remained relatively stable, With no major political upheaval since the Grenada debacle in 1983. Latin America has also remained democratic and stable since the Panama invasion. The United States has become very complacent about the Caribbean and Latin America and has not invested much time or political capital in helping the region overcome some of its chronic economic problems and political vulnerabilities. Previous administrations have treated the Caribbean with benign neglect. Their Caribbean foreign policy has focused on drug interdiction, stemming the flow of illegal immigration, stopping transnational criminal activities, and keeping the sea lanes safe for maritime commerce and to prevent terrorism. Regional security has also been a concern for the United States, given the political instability, economic decay, high youth unemployment, and a high level of political corruption and bribery that is plaguing many islands in the Caribbean. More importantly, the sale of passports to wealthy foreign nationals pose a great security risk for the United States and the Caribbean in general. And the Trump administration may seek to impose greater pressure on regional governments to end the practice. Another concern is the use of tax haven or offshore tax accounts used by wealthy foreigners, particularly American citizens and corporations, to shield their assets from the Internal Revenue Service and to avoid paying their fair share on taxes on overseas profits. This is of great concern to the President, and it is likely that he will call for greater scrutiny of that industry. But I have to emphasize that President Trump has interest in some 36 offshore companies, and I'm pretty sure some of them are registered in the Caribbean. So President Trump would have a vested interest in preserving the offshore tax havens currently in the Caribbean, in some states in the United States and elsewhere. China's role in the region has raised eyebrow to Washington. China has replaced the United States in terms of its foreign assistance and infrastructural investment. China's trade with the Caribbean has also increased at a faster pace due to its cheap cost of import and low productivity in the Caribbean. China has signed a number of economic agreements with Caribbean countries and has surpassed the United States in its per capita direct foreign investment in the Caribbean. I expect that trend to continue, and it looks irreversible from my vantage point. Under the Trump presidency, one can expect a series of decree or policy pronouncements that will impact the Caribbean and more specifically the British Virgin Islands. The pace of deportation of illegal immigrants will accelerate, as I indicated earlier. A decline in legal immigration and a tightening of visa requirements for both students and visitors alike are likely to impact the Caribbean population and also the BVIs. A more aggressive drug interdiction policy and sanctioning of countries that do not cooperate. Greater emphasis on combating transnational criminal activities, including money laundering, tax evasion, bank fraud, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking. The region, given its lack of adequate resources to patrol its waters and the susceptibility to bribery of government officials in the Caribbean, terrorists and criminal gangs can easily exploit these vulnerabilities to carry out operations in or against the United States. Trump's policies that are likely to impact the Caribbean most, his military spending, which simultaneously calls for a reduction in foreign assistance and in public diplomacy. This will lead to an increase in fees for Caribbean nationals who apply for visas to come to the United States, an increase in fees for Caribbean nationals who are residents of the United States who are looking to become citizens. Trump has also called for building a border wall and to accelerate the rate of deportation of illegal, particularly criminal aliens. That is likely to impact the Caribbean negatively in that the mass deportation of undocumented criminals to Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana has already led to a spike in crimes in all three countries, and that statistic is likely to grow. Trump proposed 2018 budget will also lead to a significant reduction in health, environmental, social, and technical assistance to the Caribbean. Trump's trade agenda may also lead to a cancellation of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which grants duty-free or low tariff for Caribbean exports of certain goods to the United States. An effort to help revive the Rust Belt in the United States may also lead to more restrictions on imports of agricultural goods from the Caribbean. This will further destroy the agricultural sector in the Caribbean, which was severely damaged by the U.S. challenge before the World Trade Organization of preferential treatment given by the European Union to Caribbean, African, and Pacific countries in the past. Trump has little appreciation for international law or international institutions, which he thinks constrain the efforts of the United States to project its powers abroad. He has signaled a willingness to cut U.S. contributions to international institutions, especially the United Nations and its affiliate agencies, and the World Bank. He has also called for more burden sharing among allies such as Japan, South Korea, and European member states of NATO. Trump's rejection of scientific evidence linking carbon dioxide to climate change will force the U.S. not to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed just about a year ago. It will be detrimental to the Caribbean as a whole. Global warming is leading to an increase in sea temperature, which is causing stronger hurricanes in the Caribbean. Global warming is also causing a rise in sea level, which ultimately will lead to the disappearance of some of our islands and is very destructive of the coral reefs. A drastic change in the Earth's temperature is likely to undermine the marine environment in the Caribbean and impact the tourism sector negatively. Climate change may also impact the fishing and agricultural industries in the Caribbean and lead to greater dependency on imports of food from Europe and the United States. Trump's anti-globalization stance may also impact the service and financial sectors in the Caribbean. Globalization has helped lifted some Caribbean countries out of poverty, namely the BVI and other British overseas territories. Globalization has also facilitated the movement of people, goods, and capital, and made it possible for people anywhere in the world to conduct business without having to leave their country of residence. The financial sector is a net benefactor of globalization. Mr. Trump has threatened to punish companies that shift their operations abroad and inadvertently exporting American jobs. This sentiment may ultimately be used against wealthy Americans who have used the financial sectors in the Caribbean and elsewhere to either shelter their assets from the reach of U.S. jurisdiction. The Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, which is one the Trump administration has at his disposal, which requires foreign jurisdictions to disclose the name of Americans with hidden assets in their financial institutions. Trump may also seek to enforce the anti-bribery law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to pursue foreign officials and American citizens who use these financial centers to illegally transfer money into secret bank accounts in Switzerland and elsewhere, or to buy luxury real estate in New York and Miami. Mr. Trump may also rethink, given that he owns some of the luxury real estate in Miami that these foreigners are buying into. So again, yes, he wants to challenge he has indicated an effort to either repeal or to de-emphasize the enforcement of the FCPA, and there may be a direct correlation between Mr. Trump's business interests and what he does with that particular law. The Security and Exchange Commission is currently investigating alleged bribery paid to the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Joseph Kabila, by an Israeli businessman, Dan Gittler, and his company, Laura Enterprise Limited, which is registered in an offshore tax haven in the Caribbean. Through the Cayman Islands, Mr. Gittler managed to transfer $45 million+ to Joseph Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As you're probably well aware, the DRC is one of the richest countries resource-wise in Africa, but one of the poorest countries in Africa and in the world. $100 million given to the president, who is supposedly illegally still in office because there is a term limit in the DRC, but he never prepared for new elections, and consequently he's still there. $100 million can provide education to over 100 million children in the DRC, or to provide health care to the same number of children. Yet the money is transferred from accounts to accounts in the name of fictitious, whether companies or individuals with no traces. Trump proposed reform of the US tax code will also have a major impact on the Caribbean, and in particular the BVI, the Cayman Islands, and other offshore financial sectors in the Caribbean. A reduction in US tax rate, which Mr. Trump has called for, which will be 15%, will encourage American citizens to repatriate their overseas assets back to the United States. It will also encourage companies like Google, Microsoft, and others that are holding billions of dollars in overseas profits in offshore jurisdictions, instead of repatriating much of it back to the United States and reinvesting it in the US economy. It will eliminate the incentive for corporations to keep their overseas profits or to put it in tax havens elsewhere. Finally, the new OECD Common Reporting Standards Agreement, the CRS, which requires all signatories to share tax information with each other about holdings by foreign nationals in their jurisdictions, will significantly undermine the offshore financial sectors in the Caribbean. Foreigners with assets in the BVI, the Cayman Islands, and elsewhere will no longer be able to conceal their assets, because that information legally will be required to be available to other signatories to that agreement. Nor will there be any incentive to register fictitious corporations or trusts in the Caribbean or elsewhere as a means to evade taxes or to shield assets obtained through bribery, money laundering, drug trafficking, corruption, or by any other unscrupulous means. Foreign government officials and corrupt businessmen will find it more difficult to shield their assets from international scrutiny as a result of the new Trump administration tax plan, or the US Treasury more aggressive monitoring of these activities. Overall, there is no need to panic or to be alarmed about a Trump presidency, because we have not yet seen any concrete proposals coming from the administration. However, if the rhetoric coming from Trump is any indication of what he intends to do, we can expect a very rough 4 years for the Caribbean on a whole, and the BVI to some extent. Given Brexit and the status of the BVI under international law, I can only hope and be optimistic that the situation under Trump or the current disengagement of Britain from the European Union may have on the BVI and the Caribbean in general. But I think whether it's Brexit or the new Trump administration, neither one of the leaders in Britain or in the United States have quite articulated their policies going forward, whether President Trump wants to completely disengage from the international system or the UK wants to disengage completely from the EU. So a soft or hard Brexit is still being debated, and it may very well be a no Brexit. So, and we are waiting to see what happens on that side. And with Mr. Trump, maybe his next tweet will tell us what to expect in his next 100 days. So I thank you very much, and I will let up to the panel, I guess. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilaire. And now I'd like to bring to the stage Ms. Shayna Smith, who is the Managing Director of the Management Consultancy, Smith & Associate, and Vice President of Business at the BVI Chamber of Commerce and Hotel Association. She's also the host of Vigilante Dialogues, a local community awareness TV program on CBN TV, and an avid political advocate. Shayna Smith.
Good evening, everyone. So joining us on our panel this evening will be Mr. Robert J.D. Bryant from Conyers, Dill and Pearman, as well as Mr. Russell Harrigan of Oyster Marketing. Please welcome them to the stage now. Okay, so Dr. Hilaire, first let me thank you for a very informative presentation. And I was busy making some notes, so I'm looking forward to now asking the questions of yourself and the panel in regards to, the bringing it local as well as regional. So I'm going to start off by asking, in terms of now for regional governments, including our own here locally, because there's so much speculation, so to speak, around these policies, what should be the stance of governments in terms of looking at things like trade and how put the potential of the effects that may come?
Well, as I said, I think the president is has not been specific in drawing out his trade agenda or his foreign policy agenda, so it's sort of somewhat a wait and see. But if you go back to the last 2 decades of American foreign and trade policies, whether it's President Bush, President Obama, and even President Clinton, it's been an attempt to draw up trade agreements outside of the WTO. So you have these regional trade agreements that really does not have very much to do with trade. These agreements have to do with services, intellectual property rights, dispute settlements, environment, health issues. So the traditional conception of trade agreements that were negotiated under the GATT back in 1947, or even under the WTO post-1945, are no longer the trade issues that we are dealing with today, and hence it's become less trade, more of regulation or harmonies and regulations and issues as intellectual property rights and health issues, environmental, human rights issues, all linked to trade. And I do not believe the BVI does as much trade, or the Caribbean, that would require any kind of concern for what's going on in the U.S.
So we should just keep an eye on him?
Yes.
Okay. So along that vein, Robert, in terms of financial services, he spoke a lot about, again, prospective policies and things that could affect the financial services industries here. What are your thoughts in terms of some of the points that were raised?
Sure, thank you. First of all, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, an honor, so I appreciate the opportunity to chat. And I'll start out by saying I agreed with much of what Professor said, but if I left it at that, this wouldn't be very interesting. I would not be invited back. So my remit here is fairly narrow, at least to start, which is on financial services, and particularly how it affects the BVI. I think I've been asked to speak because, frankly, a majority of my practice involves U.S. companies, U.S. clients. That's my background. And I think it's necessary to, Professor had comments about the tax code changes and its impact on the BVI. And I think it's important to understand generally what BVI companies are used for, to the extent anyone can, but there's been research done and fairly good handle on it, and particularly where BVI companies are used by Americans and whether the change in the tax code will have any impact on the BVI and our incorporation numbers and financial services industry. I'd like to answer that in two parts. One is companies, Microsoft, Starbucks, Amazon, Google, some of whom, frankly, I've looked into, and what they do. And then secondly, individuals, and whether they use BVI codes, American individuals. On the Microsoft's, Amazon and such, the lowering of the tax rate will have implications, but it'll have implications for the tax treaty jurisdictions, with very low tax rates, notably Ireland and Luxembourg. They're the ones that have fairly large bases now that hire staff, a real physical presence to support those offshore profits, which then cannot be repatriated without suffering burdensome tax, and the lowering of the tax rate will affect those operations in Ireland and Luxembourg. But Bermuda, BVI, Cayman, we don't have any tax treaties with the United States. We have tax information exchange agreements, but no tax treaties. No one sets up a BVI company to take advantage of our low tax rate, because it's a zero tax rate. That's why we have no tax treaties. So the lowering of the tax rate will actually, in my view, have very little implication on our business, particularly from that narrow aspect. And to the extent that money can be put back to use and growing America and such, then that's all the better. The other aspect I'd like to touch on is the individual, American individual. And again, I don't have insight into all 400-odd thousand BVI companies, but I can tell you very few are actually set up by Americans, certainly sheltering assets. That's not what BVI codes globally are used for, frankly, especially with FATCA, CRS, KYC has been in place for over almost 2 decades now. But certainly out of the US, because the fear of the IRS, the American government, frankly, I don't recall ever seeing a company being set up or advising on it or anything from Americans that were hiding or sheltering assets. So just to finish off your question, what do I do? Frankly, I advise Americans doing joint ventures with Chinese or Europeans or South Americans or just people from the rest of the world where they need a neutral vehicle. I also advise Silicon Valley companies that have set up a BVI co, again, because they're attracting money from a global audience. And then finally, U.S. multinationals carrying on business that may not have multiple shareholders in their structure, but they'll be a wholly owned subsidiary to carry on mining operations elsewhere in the world, and they just need a vehicle to hold, frankly, the local company that's held by another company, and that's just for ease of organization. So I think the Trump administration will have many implications for the global economy, the world, you and me individually, and happy to chat about that. But just to answer very narrowly for now, I don't see anything that impacts directly BVI financial services as a narrow product.
Russell, would you like to chime in there?
Yeah, if I may take the, thanks for the invitation. If I may take the narrow angle, like as Robert did before we probably start crossing each other's paths. I think if Trump is able to do some of the things he promised, which is a big if, from a tourism standpoint, the BVI should be fine. For example, he campaigned and talked about growing the US economy by double digits. I think Obama's accomplished 2.5. He's talking about 4 and 6. I think that's a big stretch. If he can get to 3, sustained for the 4 years, he will certainly extend the breadth of the economy that we have been benefiting from over the last several years during Obama's term, and that'll be a good thing. On another level, if he's also able to reduce the taxes as he's been promising, which gives people a lot more disposable income, and the level of visitors that we attract from the US, our largest market, that too will help us to a great extent. Some of his rhetoric, particularly in the area of immigration and those type of things, are going to also detract and repulse, is probably the better word, people from going to the US. And hopefully some of them would decide that they want to go to some of the other parts of the world, including the Caribbean. I suspect there'll be quite a few Americans going into Europe, but very few going into, increasingly going into the US. Other parts of the world, I would suspect that too will continue to be the case. Whether or not he's going to get a tax cut done as he's promising is going to be a big if. He's going to have to come up against some of his own people in the Congress, the likes of the Speaker, who is very conservative and who don't like high deficits. There's a chance that those tax cuts could open up a hole of $3 to $5 trillion over 10 years. How is he going to fix that is a whole question. But those are some of the challenges that I see, particularly with his or benefits, I should say, that the BVI can accrue. Overall, I think from where I sit, from leaving his other policies aside, from a tourism standpoint, if he is really able to move the economy along as he's projecting, I think that'll certainly be a good thing for us.
While I have you on the mic, one of the questions I had was actually in terms of, again, that you were mentioning in terms of the benefit, because if he now has this, I guess this economic empowerment approach, and he's making America great again, that means more American tourists for us, do you think?
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. As I said, if he is able to move the rate up to 3%, I'm going to be modest, really that's going to help us, because I think for the next 5, forget for a minute he might get reelected, at least for the next 5 years, he will extend the growth trend that we're on, and that could only be a good thing for the BVI.
Okay, great.
Tourism-wise.
Tourism-wise, okay. Dr. Hilaire, as far as the policies as it relates to the region, what would be probably the one that's most concerning to you in terms of the trend or the seeming philosophy in terms of U.S. Position in the world now, as far as what they're doing? Like, say, for example, with him disregarding, I would say, the notion of climate change, and knowing that there are several funds or nonprofit organizations that are being set up so that the Caribbean region can benefit from putting projects in place. Would that be one of those things that we need to pay close attention to, and exactly how should we approach it? Because here it is, this is a world leader that sits at the table with the G7 and them, and how should we respond to something like that?
Well, thank you very much. I just want to say one thing about the tax issue, where there's serious doubt as to whether this tax reform proposal will go through, because it's contingent on the Republicans being able to repeal the Obama healthcare law. And the fact that they couldn't, which would have left them $800 billion to play with in this new tax reform, it's very unlikely that you could pass a tax reform that's going to increase the deficit by trillions of dollars in 10 years, because we have a law in the US right now, the budget resolution or the sequestration, that prevents the Congress from passing any law that is not budget neutral. So we can't increase the deficit by passing any new legislation. So unless you could find the monies from elsewhere that would cover that loophole, then it's difficult to see how the tax code is going to change. On the climate change issue, what President Obama did, which was a very wise idea, was to basically sign the Paris Agreement as an executive order, but to link it to a previous treaty that was approved by the United States Senate, which is the UN Climate Change Treaty. And hence, there's a 4-year transition in which, if the United States chooses to withdraw, it would have to withdraw after President Trump leaves office if he only served 1 term. So therefore, yes, President Trump has threatened to defund all UN climate activities, which would impact the Caribbean, because we do, both Caribbean governments and civic organizations do receive funds from the United Nations to implement the climate change measures. But it's going to be very difficult for the United States to withdraw. We will not fund, and I think the policies or the attitude of the Trump administration to basically disregard US international obligations, whether it's under the WTO or under the United Nations, is something of great concern to Caribbean countries, because when the world's leader can take exceptions to international law and institutions and institutional obligations, then it encourages other countries, not necessarily the Caribbean, but Latin American countries and countries like Russia, Turkey, Philippines, and others to follow suit. And I think that in itself will hurt any kind of solidarity at the United Nations for these kinds of measures that would be beneficial to the region.
Thank you. Let me pause at this point and invite our audience and check and see if there are any questions for the panel. Okay, not at this point. All right, we'll continue. So, Robert, you have a list. What's probably the highlight, or you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to comment, if with Robert's permission.
Okay.
On the point that the good doctor made. If you look at the climate change issue, I mean, he's absolutely right, which is that he's got to wait 4 years. One of the other challenges he faces, though, or the U.S. faces, is that the Chinese have taken an alternate position, which is the Chinese have stepped up to the plate and said, look, we want to continue this. So that puts him in a very awkward position, because here is his counterweight competitor, who is saying a couple of things on the issue of climate change, taking an alternate position, and similarly taking an alternate position on issues of globalization. So what does that mean? That is the U.S. really going to become a backwater? I hardly believe so. I think he is probably going to, as he's done on so many issues over the last 98 days, change his position gradually. And if you notice too, there is a kind of shift in the administration going on, for those of us who watch it as closely as we probably shouldn't. The Bannon wing of the White House is, at least for now, seem to be waning, and the Ivanka Kirshner wing of the White House seems to be ascending. And I think that the daughter is going to have some sway with him on climate change. And I think this is the reason why you notice they were supposed to have some meetings last week to decide where they were going, and they couldn't, because, well, she has another view, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to grapple with that. But I think more importantly, though, on the global stage, if you have China saying we're going to go along, it really puts him in a little bit of an awkward position. And there's benefits to going along. And the Chinese aren't going along because they realize now they polluted the world. Chinese are going along because they're shifting. And there's industries that are attached to the shift that are the industries of the future. And whoever gets there for us is who's going to control things. And I think that's part of it that he's going to have to grapple with. And some of the people in his administration are going to pull him back and say, you can't do that, it's going to really hurt us. So I think he's going to probably, like he's done, as I said before, on so many fronts, going to at least walk it back a little bit before he takes a firm decision.
Well, I would agree with that. It's now moving away from the BVI, financial industry sector, moving on a bit. Without getting too political, so much of what Trump says is difficult to listen to and believe in and support. But he does, at times, seem to ameliorate his views as a result of the shifting powers within the White House. And again, coming back to a selfish analysis, I should say the cost of these changes may be great. Global warming, it may be significant and too much. But very, again, selfishly, narrowly, if he does manage to make America great again, that is, frankly, good for the BVI, for the Virgin Islands. There was talk about China being the dominant economic power, certainly number two. Is that good for the Virgin Islands? We're very close to the United States. I think its strength is important to us. Query whether Donald Trump will manage to make America, I think it's already great, frankly, but greater, and query what the cost is. But by no means a supporter, but have watched the news every night. I never used to do that before, and becoming less offended, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah, it had all of us entertained for a whole year.
An entertainer, he does it very well. Sadly, I don't mean that as a compliment.
Yeah. I think one of the things too that probably is kind of an aside, but it ties into the discussion in terms of, persons voted for him. So what he represents is supposedly the public opinion of Americans now and their view. Is it really that Americans are disillusioned with globalization? Because we know, this has been the mantra of Americans for years now, decades. Is it something really that they have bought into, or is it the political rhetoric of, having jobs brought back and, again, economic empowerment? Is that something really a stage that he can realistically set, or,
Well, there's no question 52 million people voted for President Trump, and many of them in the Rust Belt, but there were highly educated, high-income people who also voted for Donald Trump. The election was part of backlash against President Obama, against the demographic trends I spoke of in my presentation, that people resent the fact that in some states we see a minority population emerging. And more importantly, there was that strong resentment to the fact that a large number or a significant number of African Americans and Latinos and others were moving up the economic and social ladder in the United States. People who see it on late night news or on the 6 o'clock news in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, resented it, and basically when hard times fall on people, they tend to become anti-immigrant, anti-people who look different from them. And Donald Trump fed into that narrative, basically. I mean, he saw an opening. But much of what Donald Trump had to say during the campaign, much of what he said in his 100 days, are not going to benefit the very same people that he seeks to represent. His tax reform is going to be detrimental to their current economic and social conditions. It's going to cut public services for many of these communities.
his healthcare reform would have stripped about 20 million people of healthcare, the very same people who voted for Donald Trump in Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana, Ohio, and elsewhere. And even his trade policies would be detrimental to many of these communities. It is reviving the coal industry in the United States will be a setback for the U.S., not a jobs creator. It's a job killer. China is investing billions in renewable energy, in solar energy. This is where the United States was always strong, in technological innovation. The Make America Great and America First is not investing in education, is not investing in innovation. So it's taken the United States backward, not forward. And if we look at this policy and how it impacts the Caribbean, well, the Caribbean is situated in an area that is earthquake prone. We're also situated in a hurricane area. And we pay a high price for energy in the Caribbean. Countries like Jamaica, a significant percentage of Jamaica's GDP goes towards import of energy. So if the Caribbean can switch to renewables, solar and efficient vehicles and what have you, wind energy, it would be better for the Caribbean region, but also the United States could be the leading investor in that area. It's left to China because the Chinese are able to produce the solar units at a much cheaper rate than what is being done in the United States. So I believe there may be some rethinking in the Trump administration. The Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, has admitted that human activities on the planet does contribute to climate change. His Secretary of the Interior thinks the same. And Texas is the leading state in terms of renewable energy, wind energy. So if Texas, one of the most conservative states in the union, can make that shift under Rick Perry, I believe as Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry is going to have some influence on President Trump in modifying his pessimism about the impact of human activity on climate change. So we simply have to wait and see whether the Ivanka wing or the Bannon wing win his ears on any given day.
See who wins. Okay. Okay, in your presentation, we also touched about migration, both illegal and legal migration. In one article I was looking at, they had reported that about 3.2, they're estimating, because I always ask, how do you know the people are illegal? They're not registered. But it's estimated that there were at least 3.2% of the illegal immigrants in the US were from the Caribbean. And in the article, they were talking about the fact, which has been the norm for years, where these are persons that are sending money back home. So if, again, with the proposed crackdown, how do we see that affecting the region? Just for anybody.
I read that article in the BVI News today that they're proposing a 2% withholding or a collections tax for any money that's being wired to a list of jurisdictions that supposedly has a large number of illegal immigrants to the U.S. I can't answer this, but first of all, I can't imagine why BVI is included in that list. If there's any illegal immigrants whatsoever, it's probably 10, 20. But but that is something to watch. As I understand, it's been introduced by a congressman. Many changes take place between introduction of legislation and if enactment or final enactment. But that, frankly, is very, I'm not scared because it cannot pass as enacted. It means every single payment of US dollars to the BVI, no matter where it comes from, no matter for what purpose, as based on this article, will be taxed at 2%. So London wires money to a supplier here, US goes via New York, therefore 2%. services rendered. So that is a fear, and that is an example where the blunt instrument of the Trump administration via a congressman could very much hurt the BVI. Again, maybe I'm being too optimistic. I just can't believe. I've seen a lot of legislation over the years. It gets amended constantly, but that is, I sent it to our office manager saying, make sure we follow this. So it's on the radar screen. So
I think one of the, on the immigration side and the repatriation of nationals, not that we have tons of nationals here to be repatriated, I don't think that's so much a high concern for the BVI. I think one of the areas that we have to be careful about on a regional level is if he steps up the whole sending back of hardened criminals for an area that is whose economy is substantially based on tourism, whether or not we as a region have the capacity and the ability to deal with the management of those people can potentially become a challenge. In addition to that, obviously, it puts added cost on us and having to take scarce resources and build things like prisons. But that's something that needs to be watched, because it's probably one that we can't, as a region, have much say over. He's going to send them back, and they show up on your shows, and they can change your peace and quiet matrix overnight. And that can, in itself, if not monitored, can become a problem. And you might say, well, in our case, BVI, we might not have, I'm sure there's some people who will end up coming here, and some already came over the number of years, but you know, you might say, well, why are you worried? Well, I'm worried because if some of the larger islands where it could happen and there are spikes in serious crime, you know how the press is, then they're going to say all the Caribbean has a problem. And even those of us who might not have the problem will end up with a problem that we didn't have. And the only way we can deal with some of that sometimes is to try to differentiate yourself. And to do that is going to cost you money that you're going to have to then expend to try to combat that and to push it back. So that's something I think we need to, as a region, be conscious of.
I'd like to say, again, many of the nurses or health-related employment in the United States, a significant percentage of Caribbean people, particularly from Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Lesser Antilles, employed in that sector. There are also a lot of guest agricultural workers coming from the Caribbean, working in the agricultural sector in Florida and elsewhere in the South. And we also have a lot of young professionals, whether it's IT or others who come, or students who come from the Caribbean, particularly in the sciences, who study in the United States, go on to graduate school, whether it's medical school or engineering, and end up getting hired by companies in the United States. Under the president's new immigration plan and the executive order he signed to scale back the H-1B2 visas, it would reduce the number of people coming into the IT sector, and of course it will not affect only India but also people from the Caribbean, and making it difficult for foreign students, particularly those in science, math, and engineering who are coming from the Caribbean and elsewhere. Some 75% of our PhDs in engineering, the hardcore sciences, foreign nationals, and I think at least 10% are from the Caribbean. If they find it difficult to remain in the United States because of their inability to get work permits to stay, it will definitely have an impact on the Caribbean. Also, domestic workers in many of the nursing homes in the United States, you find large numbers of Caribbean nationals are employed in those sectors. And I cannot emphasize more the criminal element of that aspect of the immigration plan. Although President Obama had deported a very large number of criminal undocumented nationals, and some went to Jamaica, Trinidad, and Guyana. Under the Trump plan, I think we could expect an acceleration of the deportation of criminals and those who were caught in the United States illegally. There's also the issue of human trafficking, where the Caribbean is somewhat a gateway where people come to the Caribbean, particularly the BVI, then go to the U.S. Virgin Islands, then go on directly to the United States, or people go to Mexico, particularly Haitian nationals and Africans who go through Mexico or Costa Rica, then work their way to the border and try to get into the United States and seek asylum. President Trump is not very much in favor of respecting the Geneva Convention on the protection of refugees or asylum seekers. So we can expect some negative consequences of his new immigration policies, either way we look at it.
Okay. Thank you. Audience? They're so riveted. Okay, while we're waiting on you, the audience, I have one question. In terms of manufacturing, we know we do have U.S. manufacturing in the region. Like, I think, like for example, Coca-Cola, they still have factories around. What do we see in terms of even their response being? Is it something, because in terms of places having set up free trade zones, again, to the benefit of U.S. manufacturers in the region, you know, what would be a shift there that we may expect to see or they are looking closely at?
Sure. If I actually, before I answer that, just like to share an election day story that it's personal, but made me wonder. Much like the professor, I'm sure everyone was very surprised by the results on election day. But I realized the night of election, I was watching CNN, and I looked at the map. This was before the Trump vote. This was the Barack Obama vote. And it had the red states and the blue states. And I realized I had visited every single blue state but one, New Mexico, and I had not visited any of the red states but one, Texas. And why is that? It's not on purpose at all. Part of it's work, mostly, frankly. Our work comes coincidentally from the blue states, from the coasts. But I've made it a personal mission. Sadly, it's not for work, I'll have to do it myself, but to visit some of those red states. I don't think we'll be getting work out of Wyoming or Iowa or Utah, but I do wish to visit some of those. It just struck me how, through economics, would not have visited the red states. To answer the question about manufacturing, though, I assume this is manufacturing outside of the U.S., but perhaps by U.S. multinationals and bringing product back into the U.S. Again, I'm not sure there's a large manufacturing center in the BVI, so I don't think it'll affect us here. But I do think for those, I think that's exactly what Trump is going after, frankly, and I think NAFTA in particular, Mexicans and Canadians will have barriers being imposed, possibly. He criticized Canada for lumber, but then said we will not destroy NAFTA, we just want to renegotiate. But there's China. That's exactly what Trump is going after, frankly, the wall, amongst others. And Caribbean manufacturing is by no means protected. Again, just inwardly looking, I think we're actually in a good position because there is very little manufacturing in the Virgin Islands that goes to the U.S. A lot of services, though, and he's not targeted services, i.e. incorporations, accounting, legal work, and such. So I keep feeling very selfish to look at the very narrow Virgin Islands hat, but again, it's not negative, but I do fear for the global economy, and obviously that has negative implications for us here. But narrowly, directly, not much, but that's the concern.
I would add to that there are probably some opportunities too that will accrue to the swift and the fast of the region. If you look at the issue of the visa thing, where he's saying he don't want them in there, although he's having a huge fight with places like Silicon Valley over that issue, is that an opportunity for some of us? Right now, a lot of them come from India, so they're going back there, but they're also going to Nigeria and other places. let's think outside the box. That's a high net value person. Can we not collectively now across the region find ways where we can facilitate some of this, which introduces a high net worth individual, one, but more important than that, over the long term, a new level of investment, a new level of industry that can potentially have legs. And it doesn't have to be the larger islands. It can be for small islands like us. We have an issue of trying to diversify economy. We don't need 100,000 of them, but we can use some of them depending on what they have. If we have a strategy, that is, we must be bold enough to think like that. Because if he's closing his door and saying, we don't want you, isn't that an opportunity? Canada, I have to say Canada and the young Prime Minister, and your young Prime Minister in Canada is playing it brilliantly. He's positioned himself as the anti-Trump without being antagonistic to Trump, but positioning himself policy-wise to be the beneficiary of some of the people that he's saying he doesn't want in the U.S. Trudeau is saying, don't go west, young man, come north. And he's very clever in doing that because he is looking to the future. And if he succeeds, by jolly, he's going to put himself and his country in a good place. So the region needs to perhaps look at these things and these opportunities from another angle. And it would mean obviously changing some rules and what have you, but rules are there to be amended to reflect the economics and the times that we find ourselves in. There might be other opportunities too because of Trump policies. I mean, it's early days, yes, but I think we need to put on that hat. He grates on all of our nerves, don't we? I think we can all agree on that, right? But we are talking about our economic livelihood, and we need to find a way to put aside for a minute the fact that he grates on our nerves with the way he speaks and all that stuff, and see if he is creating opportunities for us, and to be nimble enough to recognize it and to grab them.
Well, I do believe there will be opportunities for the rest of the world. I mean, it's been about 25 years since the end of the Cold War. The United States has been in retreat and in decline since the end of the Cold War. The United States has not articulated a post-Cold War foreign policy. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen the emergence of Brazil, India, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, even to a certain extent Russia. But the rest of the world is no longer waiting for the United States. And I think, not that I am a fan of the Chinese, I don't believe in their political system, I don't believe in their economic policies or their foreign policy. But I think the Chinese are taking advantage of this American retreat. They have created an alternative to the World Bank, which is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. They're now moving to fill the void with a new trade agreement with the countries that the United States initially negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with. And incidentally, that agreement had excluded China, which is the dominant economic and trade power in Asia. So many of the countries wanted China to be a part of it. The United States saw it more as a security and political agreement instead of a trade agreement. So China is filling that void. So to a certain extent, President Trump is really just continuing a trend that started under President George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War. And I don't think anyone would look at the United States and see how much we have wasted in the last almost 15, 20 years fighting unnecessary wars when China, Singapore, South Korea, India, Brazil are investing heavily in their human resources, training people in education, and are doing a lot better than we are doing today. So if anyone has hopes that America will be great again, I I have my doubts, and again, I've always maintained America was great during slavery when they exploited African people. It could never be great again. Thank you.
Let's change gears a bit. We haven't heard anything about Cuba. And I think this is one of the key foreign investment opportunities that's staring them right now in the face. And a lot of what happens with Cuba in terms of American investors going back in is going to be dependent on his position on a few things. What are your thoughts on that as far as the panel? Russell, I see you biting at the bit.
I would, that's a very interesting question. I want to put it in a facetious way. Trump, in a funny way, because of his positions, unlike Obama on the issue of Cuba, has given, or is giving, the Caribbean another chance to get its act together before Cuba opens, right? You know, we all, those of us at least in tourism, complain about it coming and when it's going to come and what's going to happen. Well, clearly it's happening. With the Trump administration, though, it's going to slow down because he is not going to continue Barack's initiatives there. Yes, you have other activity from Canada and Europe, but I mean, everybody's anxious about the American investment. So what I'm essentially saying is while it remains closed to the extent that it is, it's an opportunity for us to get our act together so that when the day comes that it opens, that we are a little bit more advanced. If you look at a country like the Bahamas, for example, I'm sure they're probably bowing down to, to Trump in the fact that, because they're one of the countries that would be immediately affected. The larger countries would be the immediate ones. But even the small ones like us, places like us who are into sailing, which is a huge part of our tourism, Cuba has tremendous potential. So we can't fool ourselves. I think the fact that it remains closed prevents American investment from going in there, and also going to prevent some Americans from going. They might go for the first time, but until the quality of the product gets to a point where they're really globally competitive, a lot of people are not going to go. But my read would be for it, it's not putting down the Cubans in any way. It's for us another opportunity as a region to get our tourism act together, because it will open at some point, and it would suck a lot of capacity out of other parts of the Caribbean.
Well, I agree. It's an opportunity for us, but we also have to keep in mind Cuba is a fellow Caribbean country. A significant percentage of the Cuban population look like you and I. They are our people. Some of them left the smaller islands and went to Cuba before the revolution, and their families are there. So these are our people. If Cuba were to reopen, and whatever the United States does, Cuba is going to change. The Castros are dying. The revolution has proven to a certain extent since the end of communism rather useless, so the Cubans need to make a change. So the day will come when the United States is going to realize it's better to have a détente with Cuba than to maintain that 50-year embargo and the hostility against the Castro regime. Trump said he's a businessman. Trump initially tried to invest in Cuba under Fidel Castro. So I have I sincerely believe at some point Trump's children or his son-in-law will whisper in his ears, here's an opportunity, let's take advantage of it, and we may see a change in U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba. There's no better time to do it. You have the Republicans controlling both houses of Congress, and the same way Nixon opened up to China, it's an opportunity for Trump to really bring Cuba into the fold and not have tremendous opposition from within his party, which is part of his own problem.
Okay, I have two more questions. We have a question? Sure.
I'd like to switch the conversation back to financial services. The proposed tax policy Probably a question for Robert, as well as Professor Hilaire. The Delaware and the other U.S. Incorporation centers, what could be the potential impact on those? And a few days ago, there was an article in the papers about the U.S. Virgin Islands proposing legislation or passing legislation to encourage development of its financial services. Is there any relation to the anticipated tax policy?
Well, there is already tax incentives given to hedge fund managers to establish residency in the U.S. Virgin Islands and to have all their assets excluded from federal income tax. So that's one incentive. I'm not sure if the new tax law will help us, but I think what the government of the Virgin Islands is looking at is the model in Delaware and Nevada and South Dakota, and see if we could get some of these companies to establish shop in the U.S. Virgin Islands instead of doing it elsewhere, doing it within the mainland. But part of the problem is the capacity, the infrastructure, and I mean, it's not very easy doing business from the Caribbean or in the Caribbean, and hence some of these companies may very well look elsewhere. We do have a significant percentage of our population throughout the Caribbean that is educated, but not educated enough to deal with the complexity of the global financial market. So I think there will be need for significant retraining, whether it's in the U.S. Virgin Islands or in the English-speaking Caribbean. So I don't foresee any major shift in corporations registered in Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada, making that shift to the U.S. Virgin Islands.
It's a great question to highlight what BVI is all about. So the comparison between the USVI and the BVI, I'll get to Delaware in a minute, but that comparison is between a tax or low tax jurisdiction versus a no tax jurisdiction. So the desire to attract this business to the U.S. Virgin Islands is by introducing more favorable tax rates, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, vis-a-vis other states in the 50 states. And again, it's all about tax planning, and it's such a common fallacy by the papers and by the NGOs in England that BVI codes and frankly all this Cayman, Bermuda, Jersey, Guernsey companies are set up for tax planning purposes, and they're not. It's zero tax. And there's no secrecy either. It's all transparent for the purpose of tax, money laundering, policing, and regulatory authorities. It really is set out to structure one's affairs. And we have a very large financial services sector, 400,000 companies, by far the world's leader of the overseas territory, or the offshore area, no matter how you define that. And in frankly, a fairly remote place with not a lot of people. And it just shows how an efficient efficient vehicle, I should say, the BVI business company, can sell when it has zero tax. You don't have to worry about tax. You don't have to, you pay this tax or that tax, you get this advantage, that. There's zero tax, that's all. And we have no clue what your tax advantage is on your home jurisdiction. But we will get your information and give it to your home jurisdiction. So don't think you can hide your assets, but it's up to you to figure out what the benefits are. And so that's why BVI is so successful, super efficient, super simple, and no tax analysis whatsoever, but transparency. As for Delaware and Wyoming and the other states, for the most part, Delaware and those companies are used by Americans for Americans. If you're a joint venture between a Texan and a Floridian, you're probably going to go to Delaware. And that will continue, and I'm not confident it is subject to the tax rate. I don't see that changing that analysis. But you bring in an American and a Chinese, an American and an Argentinian, then you go to BVI. Of course, that's changing slightly as there is transparency of all across the globe, except in the United States. So frankly, if you're a dodgy person out of some country outside the US and you want to set up a vehicle that's absolutely opaque and no transparency, and you're kind of worried about US taxes, but oh, it's 15%, that's pretty low, I'd go to Delaware.
It's an interesting comment because lowering the taxes potentially draw some business in for the U.S. At the end of the day. Yeah, not good business, but I'm sure those people in Delaware say business.
Just a follow-up question. So with the lower tax rate, we talked about the increased wealth in the U.S., which could help tourism. Would that present opportunity for other financial services product funds, for instance? Because more wealth in the U.S. means Americans want to invest. If U.S. economy is closed, they may want to invest externally. So is there an opportunity for BVI from having more wealth, wanting to seek higher returns?
Sure, let me jump in with that one first, if that's okay. I'm a firm believer that a strong America means more growth in financial services, more joint ventures, more cross-border transactions, more of what we do, more use of BVI codes for proper purposes. I want to be careful though, so only U.S. growth, in the hedge fund example, for example, they use domestic funds. So if you're entirely domestic, you will use a domestic fund. Again, Delaware would be the jurisdiction, which makes eminent sense. If you're American, attracting Americans, involving America, you stay entirely within the four walls of the border, or whatever that is now, of the United States. It's only when you want to attract wealth from around the world that you set up an offshore hedge fund. And so again, if it's just growth within the U.S., just investing back in the U.S., I don't think that will actually have direct impact on us. But frankly, it'll never just go back into the U.S. It'll be people setting up successful domestic funds. They need an offshore fund. They need a joint venture if they're a manufacturer. They need investments. They're acquiring assets in South America, in Africa, in India, wherever. And so that all leads to business growth. I'm not confident MAGA, as I hear I've called one time, Make America Great Again. I'm not confident that's going to happen, but if it does, that's the silver lining in a rather stormy environment. So.
Well, again, I want to emphasize that I don't think Americans are really going to rush back and repatriate their assets if the tax code were to change and their rate is now 15%. I think one of the things we need to look at is this, these net worth individuals who have tremendous assets at their disposal and looking to change their nationalities to avoid the tax burden in one jurisdiction or the next. And I mentioned the sale of passports by Caribbean governments, or Malta, Portugal, Spain. Even the United States has an economic citizenship policy. So if you invest $1 million in a depressed community in the US and create jobs, you can get a residency visa and ultimately a citizenship. In Malta, you spend $1 million and you get an EU passport, the same with Portugal and Spain. So a number of wealthy individuals from around the world are looking to change their nationality, and with Trump in power, we have seen an increase in people renouncing their American citizenship simply because of the uncertainty of the U.S. position in the world, but also precisely for the threat a Trump administration pose to the financial security and future of American citizens. So I think on one hand, we're expecting to see an increase in people seeking multiple nationalities or getting passports in other jurisdictions where they can claim Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Antigua as their home and as their nationality instead of the United States. So that's something we need to look out for. And more importantly, you have a number of maybe a few million people in the world who are now enjoying the status of global citizens. Their parents are from Syria or the Caribbean. One parent is American, the other is British. And I mean, that phenomenon is not likely to slow down anytime soon. So that is definitely going to make it more difficult for the United States.
If I can just jump in, there's actually one, this is a very narrow topic, but important one, carried interest, and it's directed at hedge funds. And you'll read about it now and then. It was in the New York Times today. And it's the hedge fund managers who frankly make billions of dollars, and they do not repatriate that income. It's held in their offshore fund, tax-free. And so that actually is one area of concern, frankly, more for the Cayman Islands, because I know that some of these funds with billions of dollars in them are actually the principals carried interest. And it just perpetuates the whole process of hedge funds, ongoing regulation, administration, and the whole industry. But I dare say some of these managers want to repatriate that money, which is probably a good thing, frankly, because you don't want artificial structures, which is what it is. But watch out for it. Carried interest, I say it was in the New York Times today, and pops up now and then. Obama said, it's not Obama, sorry, Trump said they're getting away with murder by keeping the carried interest. The problem is all his friends, though, are these people, so query whether, again, he actually makes change. But that is something in the hedge fund industry that could have an impact. So.
All right, great. So we'll start to wrap up now, if there aren't any other questions. Russell, starting with you. You're somebody? Oh, come right to the mic, sir.
Good evening. I thank the panel for a very enlightening discourse. I would like, though, to say a few words. It would seem that we are trying to discuss and plan against a background that might not exist. In thinking about Mr. Trump, perhaps Donald is just a patriot. He has diagnosed America's condition very well. He knew that his country rose through factories and industrialization. Americans prospered by the sweat of their brow. He also may have seen that prosperity had come in the universe of ideas, where they were able to let the whole world respect them for being the smartest people in the world. They have also prospered because, like the Romans of old, they had a strong military, which they could deploy anywhere in the world to seize other people's resources. Now, it would appear that having diagnosed the country's situation, Trump, it would seem, would have prescribed the answer wrongly. He thought that what made America great, we will make America great again. So one could see him as trying to turn the clock back to what made America, what America is today. Unfortunately, of course, most of us actually are judging him in terms of his campaign declarations. So perhaps we should take our time to realize that what we call Trump, there is no Trump doctrine yet. As the professor had actually cited towards the end of his delivery, there is nothing concrete yet with which we can define what Trump is or who Trump is. But we have to give it to him that he is trying to find a way. But there is nothing yet by which we can judge Trump or by which we can say, this is what Trump is, this is what he wants. Because every day we are seeing that the winds are blowing one way, today this way, tomorrow another way. So perhaps what we should do is to see what is happening and have a contingency plan, but not ourselves to try to make a concrete plan as to what to do in answer to what Mr. Trump is doing. So perhaps we should not rush to judgment. And of course, I might want to add that in our size and situation, humility goes a long way. Perhaps, we should also consider whether in our situation and our conditions, should we speak about competition with them, or should we, like the Syrophoenician woman, rather than trying to sit at the table, we may try and pick the crumbs that fall from the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's an interesting one. I don't know about the crumbs. Maybe our pride is going to get in our way of the crumbs thing. But to the extent, and I think you're absolutely right, it's only been 98 days. But let's be also honest, it's been an unusual 98 days. If Obama had done what Trump has done in 98 days, by jolly, he'd have been out of the White House long time ago. But you're right, there's no doctrine yet, but if there is a doctrine, it's two words in my mind: unpredictability and uncertainty. That has been his way. He keeps everybody on an easy position. I think that's going to continue. It certainly creates for us, as you correctly pointed out, small, little, non-existent people who will ever sit at the table. It creates a dynamic for us to be nimble and to constantly be aware of what's going on and where the currents are going, to make sure that we don't get swept away by the currents. I think one other thing I would want to suggest also in my final thought is the fact that Trump seems to be quite hostile to Europe for whatever reason. Well, who knows? But he certainly seems to be hostile to Europe. He and Merkel didn't set horse for whatever reason, maybe because she and Barack did. Chances she might get reelected. France isn't going his way at the moment. He said he predicted the Brexit thing, but that was, I think, a convenient thing. I think the point I'm making, to the extent that he's hostile to Europe, what does that create? Is that creating any opportunity for us? One of the things, and Robert probably can speak, and other people in the audience who know more about the OECD than I do, but to the extent that some of their policies are stymied, they seem to be a thorn in our side constantly. To the extent that some of the things they want to do, he doesn't sign on to them. It gives us, in my simple mind, a little bit of a breathing space to catch our wind after the last 4, 5, 6, or 7 years, and hopefully that might create for us a little bit of an opportunity. One other thing I would say, I think the professor accurately pointed out, for us, globalization, we have helped to foster it. We've moved from where we used to be economically to a place where we are a lot better. To the extent that he fosters that anti-globalism thing, it could have implications for us long term. I don't know if he's going to succeed, because China is going the other way, Canada is going the other way. You're absolutely right, the TPP thing is interesting, that they're all getting together, and we should champion that, because it means more trade globally and using the vehicles that Robert spends his time on every day and others. Also in terms of arbitration, I think that the arbitration was the vehicle to settle disputes should it happen. We are trying to create an arbitration center, and if all of those activities have arbitration clauses, hopefully at some point some of them go bad and they will end up in Rotan Tortola. So there are some opportunities, but we have to be constantly nimble. We can't sit at the table, we'll not sit at the table. So we have to, as our motto say, be ever watchful.
Thank you, Russell. Robert?
I'd just like to follow up with Russell's approach, which is look for the opportunities. I think that's fantastic and exciting, frankly. There's one in particular that I'd like to follow up on, and we talk about crumbs from the cake of the U.S. Well, you get enough crumbs, you can make your own cake. And one of those is I think I'd call it your go south young man, go south young person philosophy. Trudeau's is go north, we should bring it go south, and to the tech guys from India or wherever that are working in California. Again, just I see the legal work from that. There's tons of it. They actually like BVI companies, but they're in the US, they're surrounded by Delaware. So we actually get the tech guys in the BVI. Big ask, I know. But there's also all the work around that. Nothing to do with, there's the tech, there's all the stuff that supports tech, which I don't know. Bound to be tons of it. But then there's the legal work, the accounting work, and the incorporation work all around that, and the disputes, and the litigation, and the arbitration center. So it's, love a discussion on what opportunities arise from the Trump administration. It's so variable, it's hard to tell, but there will be some, and that's what we need to keep an eye out for. Fantastic. That's my final thoughts.
Definitely. Thank you.
I have a short question.
Go right ahead.
I just want to know, I mean, we've talked about Trump's unpredictability and the fact that he is refusing to pin himself down to something, and then he changes tomorrow and he changes back, and he's commented on the fact that he prides himself on flexibility. Do we think that this is strategy by Trump?
Well, I have to say I do not have that much confidence in President Trump's intellect. So, I mean, I could only view it that way. I do not think Donald Trump has a good grasp of domestic or international issues. He prides himself as a successful businessman, quote unquote, because he's been able to manipulate both the tax codes and business codes in other jurisdictions. But I do not believe he's a wealthy man. I do not believe he's a very bright man. And I do not believe he really understands the nature of the world. There are 7.5 billion people in the world. There are 340 million in the United States. If you want to do business, you look outside of the US where there are 7.2 billion people, not the United States.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, Trump is the president of the United States. It didn't happen by accident. There was some measure of strategy taking shape there that we didn't see coming. Somehow, all the intellectuals are befuddled, kerfuffled over the fact that Trump is actually the president of the United States of America. How did this happen? Certainly not by accident.
That's a good point. I mean, I have the argument in my house at times that no silly person can end up in the Oval Office. I think what Trump has successfully done is he's had some good people around him, and some of them who have seen an opportunity for their own never let the crisis go to waste mentality, and steering them in a direction and trying to make sure that they get their agenda through. It may be a strategy, and another 400 days we might know.
It just ties to my desire to find out. I say I haven't been to any of the red states, and frankly, I'm not sure if I know a Trump voter, and just would like to find that out. I read the fake news, as they call it, the New York Times, NBC News and stuff, so I don't know what else to say. Exactly. But we need to find out, frankly. He won. What is going on? So, got to understand that to deal with it. So.
I think just to throw a comment in there, it's indicative too of the system, because remember, even the voters were surprised because he was elected based on the electoral college system, which is not necessarily reflective of the majority vote. So that's where now there was strategy used, in fact, by making sure they got the electoral vote if they didn't get the majority for the public. So. There was one more question?
Yeah, more of a comment/question, but I'm greatly displeased that I missed the lecture, so I'm not sure if this was addressed, but is there any recognition, based on the question that Nejan asks, that Trump's victory represented some valid sentiment within the United States. You could see the same thing in the United Kingdom with Brexit, and a sentiment that exists all over the world that globalization, while it might have some benefits for some, there are some costs associated with globalization. For instance, Trump won in, I believe it was Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, some places that relied on manufacturing. Of course, manufacturing went to Asia. And these are workers who perhaps needed to be retrained to go into other industries. And perhaps that wasn't done as well as it should have. We speak about industries not coming back and new industries coming on stream, but how do we get displaced workers into those industries? So do you recognize, even though I agree with you, I don't have that much confidence in Donald Trump's intellectual abilities. He seems to me to be a narcissist. He has some personality disorders, in my view. But even given his lack of capabilities, I think he got something right that the voters recognized and voted for. Now, I think perhaps Democrats and Republicans missed opportunities to tap into that same sentiment, and perhaps they're missing the point. And perhaps it's a lesson that we can learn here in the BVI, because I believe that even in the BVI, globalization has costs and benefits. You know, rightly, we've benefited a lot from globalization. But there are some ways in which I think, without completely rejecting globalization, we can reorient ourselves so that we can benefit in other areas where we may not benefit as much. So you could comment on that.
I think one of the misconceptions citizens of the world, of various countries have, is the fact people have lost confidence in the ability of governments to deliver. 50, 60 years ago, government assisted people, whether it's in Europe or the Caribbean or elsewhere, whether it's through tax policies or through economic policies, governments do not have the means or the resources at their disposals to do what they once did, whether it's assisting people with homes, with education, with medical care and what have you. And hence people resent the fact that these services are not available, and they blame it on globalization. I mean, the United States, Britain in particular, should not be complaining about the negative impact of globalization, because what made Britain great is globalization. There's nothing great about Britain. It's a poor place. But it's great because of its global expansion. So I see no reason why, well, people are upset and they're blaming it on governments, and particularly in the United States, where so much emphasis is placed on the president's ability to deliver. Well, we saw it with President Obama, had so much good intentions and was unable to deliver as much as he promised. And I think similarly with President Trump, he's realizing that the Oval Office is not the bully pulpit that it was in 1946 onwards. So it's just a matter of time before his voters realize that Trump took them for a ride. Because the president, even though he has the majority in both houses of Congress, the election cycle in the United States has already started. So members of Congress, by the end of the summer, will be campaigning for the 2018 election, and there's no possibility that they're going to support Donald Trump on any of his policy agendas. So I don't think yes, he may have won over some people. I'm not sure he did, because in most cases when Republicans win, it's either they suppress the votes, they manipulate the ballot box, and in the recent presidential election, the influence of Russian orders who may have hacked into the US electoral system. So I sincerely don't think Trump genuinely won the elections, but we have a way to go before we could prove the other way, but we shall see.
Well, closing words.
Well, I just want to thank again Lynette Barr for making the effort to get me to take a break from Carnival in St. Thomas, which I enjoy so much, to come to BVI to give a lecture. But it tells you, one, how important I think this exercise is for me and for the people of the Caribbean and for the world. And I would not hesitate to miss Carnival in the Caribbean to do an exercise like this, because we don't know. There are some people in the audience, like this young man who spoke out, who may get something out of this to make a difference to improve the human conditions, not only of people in the Caribbean, but throughout the world. So again, I thank you for coming. I thank Lynette and the committee for inviting me, and I hope you got something out of my delivery tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilaire, for coming to share such valuable information with us. Without further ado, I want to welcome our president, Dr. Janet Smith, to give closing remarks.
Well, it's the last of our lecture. Ever since we decided to invite Dr. Hilaire, I kept on thinking tea leaves, you know? That's all I could think. I'm glad a lot. In fact, what you really did help us do in a lot of ways was kind of organize 6 months before the election and the last 100 days, at least for me, and kind of put some things in perspective and just kind of pulled it all together. So I'm really glad that we did invite you. It's refreshing. It's a lot more refreshing than being in St. Thomas. And in essence, what I then kind of left away thinking that I was glad to see that we recognize if we've got tea leaves, then we make iced tea. I like iced tea. If you like lemonade, if you got lemon, then you make lemonade. And so that's a good perspective to walk away from. I think Dr. Smith is gone. I can't see very well, so I don't know if Mrs. Christopher is here. If you are, Mrs. Christopher, thanks for coming. Or anyone else, any of our officers who may have come in. We probably have a few faculty and staff. I know a class is missing because they usually sit almost down front. But all of you, thanks for coming. I also want to thank your family for coming with you and leaving Carnival at that. A young lady who could easily have stayed. So dad support and, you know, that kind of thing. Our sponsors are on the back of your program, Falconwood Corporation, Ocean Conversion, and we always thank Village Key for our accommodations. Kedrick, you know, we're at the end of this is our last series in the lecture series. It's a spring thing for us, so we wouldn't do it in the fall. It had lapsed a couple of years. We came back to it. I'm glad that we did. A big crowd is not necessarily indicative of success. So we will continue to do it. We will be starting up again next spring. What I'm counting on you for is to give us some ideas about people to bring in. We were playing a little bit with time, 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. We started out at 7 o'clock, ended up at 6 o'clock because of the feedback we got. I don't know whether that really was a good decision, to be honest with you, given the crowd that we have tonight. But I'm definitely grateful for you to come. Our committee, Kedrick Malone, did a fantastic job. He chairs the committee on the lecture series, and I hear from him more sometimes than I hear from my own staff. But that's a good thing. That's a very good thing, and I think it had a lot to do with the success. Dr. Kathy Smith, Richard Georges, Elton just left a few minutes ago, VP Sauda Smith, Darisha Scatchif-Thomas, our PR person, are all part of that committee, and I'm very, very grateful to them. Our ushers seem to come primarily from my office, but we've had Rowan, I don't think he's here tonight, from the fiscal office. Our team back in the back, Michael and Abreu, and those guys always right where they need to be when they need to be there. So I'm very grateful for that. More than anything else, I'm grateful for you that are here tonight. There are a lot of things I want to ask of you tonight. First of all is your feedback on the lectures. You know how to get in touch with us, Lynette or me, or just call 852-7000 and say that you'd like to give us some feedback on the lectures. You've got someone you'd like to see us bring here, or some topic that you'd like to see us bring here next week, because we'd want to hear from you. We're looking for sponsorships for next year. We've had 3 great sponsors this year. We're already looking for sponsors for next year. Tomorrow night, I'm sure you've heard the other Malone, Carvin Malone, on the radio about the gala tomorrow night in support of the Virgin Island Heritage Village, which is right south of here, where that old building is on the left-hand side on your way out. It's not too pricey a dinner to support an excellent idea. So I'm hoping that you have tickets. If you don't, I've got some that I can sell you before you leave here. So tickets are available. One of the things we're thinking about, and just started thinking about, our lecture series is over, our performance series is over for the season, or arts in the back. We still, all that wonderful art in the back is for sale. So before you go out, it's not crowded back there. Just, walk through and enjoy it, and pick one of them, and we'll be gladly sell it to you. They're very reasonably priced. The only event that we might have during the summer is probably an all-VI performance, where we try to have a lot of performers in this place, excellent performers, probably get several of those together before the August Festival shows up, to help us support the Heritage Village again, and make that what we would like to be. So again, thank you for coming, and I think we've had a wonderful season. So give my crew a hand, Lynette and Kedrick and the guys in the back, and especially our last lecturer or panelist, Shana. Thank you so much, Brian, Mr. Harrigan, all of you. Thank you, and you have a great evening.